you all for coming. Matt, would you call the roll, please?
I will. Commissioner Bean?
Here.
Commissioner Crusoe?
Here.
Commissioner Dale?
Here.
Commissioner German? Commissioner Graham?
Here.
Commissioner Honke?
Here.
Commissioner Nicewan?
Here.
Commissioner Stead?
Here.
Commissioner Teal? Commissioner Tucker?
Here.
Commissioner Wright?
Here.
Commissioner Strasburg?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Amendments and approval of the agenda. Someone move the agenda.
So moved.
Moved by Dave,
Second.
seconded by Rita. Any amendments? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And this agenda is approved. Item D, special presentations and announcements. We do have a special presentation. Before we do that, are there any announcements from members of the commission? Okay. And we do have a special presentation tonight. Rita, would you like to introduce our speakers and tell us, give us a little background on about what they're going to be talking about?
Sure. I'm going to be brief because I know we've got a lot on the agenda with commercial recycling coming up, but there are new developments and important developments going on with the 1,4-dioxane contamination of the groundwater. And at the recent meeting of the multi-jurisdictional unit called CARD, it was discussed that it was pretty important that there be greater information available to the public on this, and that the commission should pay attention to this and consider whether some recommendations may be warranted. It does seem like there are some actions that are going to be pending within the month. There was a recent article in the Ann Arbor News and an editorial on, I think it was November 21st. So I've asked two people to come tonight. They're going to be very brief. This is not going to be a long presentation. But Roger Rayle is the chair. Is that your proper title?
Vice Chair.
Vice Chair of the SIO Residents for Safe Water, which has been monitoring the 1,4-dioxane groundwater cleanup. And Roger has taken upon himself to create some very interesting Google Maps, which help to communicate very effectively some of the information of what's going on. He's going to just show a couple of these maps to you today to discuss where we're at. And I also invited Mike Gebhard here, who is from the Washington County Department of Environmental Health, who is by training a hydrogeologist and has been the county's main point person in working on the 1,4-dioxane. So he's not going to do a presentation, but he'll be available for any questions. Thank you.
Hey everybody, I'm Roger Rayle. I live in Scioto Township, but I'm Vice Chair of SIO Residents for Safe Water. We've been watching over this Pall Gelman contamination for 13 years, and I actually was going to provide this in real time with Google Earth, but since I don't have an internet connection, I'm just playing the video of it that I recorded last night. So I'll try to keep up with the video here if you want to watch. This is the area that we're going to be talking about. And this is the plume as it is depicted now. This is a 3D version of that. So we just took the company's plume map and extruded it up 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 parts per billion to give you an idea of the volume of the contamination. And as we zoom in, this is the red line there is the boundary of the prohibition zone, and this little blue line here is the 85 parts per billion. That's what the de facto groundwater standard is. And then I'm pausing it here because this portion from Maple Road East doesn't have to be cleaned up to 85 parts per billion. It's cleaned up to the groundwater surface water interface standard, where there's no more use of the groundwater down gradient, and that's 2,800 parts per billion, which is somewhat higher. Again, these are just screenshots from Google Earth. And this portion back here is at 85 at Wagner Road. They're supposed to clean up everything west of that to 85, but let me pause this here, because this right here at Maple is allowed to go at 2,800 parts per billion, but down here in the west portion, this is supposed to be 85. Well, the effect is that the company's treating everything a foot over Wagner Road as being, okay, 2,800 parts per billion. So that means this whole volume of dioxane in here doesn't have to be cleaned up, just the portion that's above the box. So there's a huge amount of dioxane there. We don't know how much because the company's never done a mass balance of the E, the deeper E aquifer, and that's something we've been calling for. In fact, we're calling for that every year. So again, we're taking it from 85 to 2,800, and this amount of dioxane is going to be allowed to go wherever it happens to go. They're hoping it goes to the river. But there's this portion over here on the other side, on the north side, that's in the Evergreen area. This by itself, anywhere else in the country, would probably be the second biggest dioxin contamination. And right now, the company's proposing, apparently, because it's on their map, they don't mention it, this little boundary here, this pink boundary, that's an extension to the prohibition zone where you can't have any use of groundwater wells, any use of the water that comes out of the ground. And there's still wells in this area. And this is extruded up to 85 parts per billion by this blue fence. And that's currently what it has to be cleaned up to. I'll let this play a little longer so you can kind of get an idea of the volume here. So everything within this little blue fenced in area has to be cleaned up to 85. But right now, apparently the company's proposing letting that go at 2,800 also. Well, why not? It's the part next door is being let go at 2,800. Well, the difference is that this portion here might be heading over here. This is Barton Pond, where you get 80% of your water. Now, this is another piece of the video here that shows you some of the analysis that's done a couple of years ago by the company for the Evergreen area, for this little portion right in here, where there's still some very high concentrations and some concentrations still going up. They're doing some active remediation here, but they're having trouble keeping up with the volume that they said they're going to keep up with. Again, I apologize for some of the delay here. Some of that's just because I'm doing this on Vista and recording it as I go. So a couple years ago, they presented this report, and for some reason they didn't orient the maps north and south. So I'm just showing you how it came across in the report. And I basically take the report page and paste it onto Google Earth so you can see how it matches up. These are the groundwater flows. Here's with pumping at a certain rate. Here's the flow arrows. You can see the particle things. It seems to be heading straight east, right? I mean, they're doing a purge here, and what doesn't get captured heads straight east. So the problem is, when you orient that north and south, it's not straight east anymore. So this is the real thing we have to be concerned about, is this is now going to the northeast. Well, what's the big deal about that? Well, for one thing, it looks like it's outside. It's going to end up outside both prohibition zones. This is what they considered where the plume is. They concluded that the plume is going to go this way, even though all those lines seem to be going to the northeast here. So if we back up and tilt it down here a little bit, you can kind of see which way it's heading. It might be heading here, but if it's off a few degrees, it could be there, or it could be here. Well, if it's here, that's bad news. You don't have any replacement for 80% of your water. This, I'll have this whole Google Earth file up on our website, srsw.org, for anybody that's viewing this, or anybody here that wants to download it and play it themselves and turn on and off the different layers that I'm doing, just like I'm doing here with this video. So this is where it's headed, and again, to give you a little idea of the volume, we're turning on this 3D. Again, this is the D2 plume, this is the deeper plume, the higher concentrations. That's a lot of dioxane to let go and not know where it's going, and not even know how much dioxane is down there because they're not doing the mass balance. If we put on top of this the actual 16,000 data points for the 20-some years that this data has been tallied, That's what I'm about to do right here. To orient this back. We're going to look at it from the northeast, from Barton Pond to see. Again, this is that map that they produced. It seems to be heading this direction. And now I'm playing the different years of data and expanding it out to a few years here at the end, so you can see each one of these is a data point. And in Google Earth, you can click on any one of these to see what the value is of that data point. It's a very useful tool for presentations like this and decision making. I'm a real advocate for everybody using Google Earth wherever they can. It's just a great tool. Now we're going to pan back from here because that's quite a lot of dioxane there, but there's still quite a bit at the core back here where they're supposed to clean it up to 85 parts per billion. There's a 3,000 some, here's a 4,000 some parts per billion. But we have to pan back a little ways, just slightly, to see the highest concentration within the last year. We have to pan back a little more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Okay, here's Saginaw Bay. Yeah, this is the highest concentration in the last couple of years is 65,000 parts per billion right there at the core. And this is a shallower well, but and this is not counting the really high concentrations in the soils that haven't been sampled since about 2000. They were supposed to sample again in 2005, but that hasn't been required. So anyway, that's the end of my presentation. I'll take a few questions. I have to leave pretty soon, but Mike Gebhard is here. He can answer any other questions that might come up.
Where are those two wells?
Well, these are all there in that area of the plume. By Wagner Road is where this highest one is, right there at the Gelman property, the Pall Gelman property, across from Dolph Park.
And in what elevation below surface is this concentration that high?
Well, let's see if I can read this on here. This one happens to be 23 feet below ground. Some of the other ones you saw were hundreds of feet below ground, 150, 180. So it basically goes from the surface all the way down to bedrock. A lot of aquifer down there.
And just for clarification, this cleanup is, for all intents and purposes, why you and even the county have not been able to get or participate or really get information or necessarily things going on is because it's really under the jurisdiction of a judge right now.
Right.
Who's making decisions on what should happen and negotiating between the DEQ and the company and.
Right. The judge is actually not actively participating at this point. He wants the two parties to work it out. And they're doing that behind closed doors. The DEQ can't talk about it until the decision's somewhat made. They say they're listening to our input and we'll pass that along, but it's not an open process. And in the past, when there haven't been open processes, we don't know what data they're using to make their decision. I'm sure they're not using this. And yet this is the same data that the company provides. And now we have a platform like this that you can actually put it together and put everything and make decisions in a group. But I don't believe they're using this. I think they're just going by the seat of their pants and whatever the company says.
Even though the city intervened on some cases, the city is not able to participate in these negotiations or just have to wait to see what happens with the final court.
The city tried to intervene and become a party to the case. The judge wouldn't allow it. In fact, he carved out a piece of the prohibition zone.
Right, our Montgomery well, Northwest Supply well was carved out of the prohibition zone, and the city ended up settling for the portion that had to do with the Northwest Supply well. Anything that, any issues pertaining to Barton are fair game.
But this is an important issue right now because it looks like the decision is going to come down within a month and would probably be in January, and there'll probably be a public hearing announced. But I wanted to give everybody here and all the people in Ann Arbor a heads up that this is not a good idea to allow this portion here to go at 2,800 parts per billion. Because if it actually is heading here, instead of being 2,800 or even 85 parts per billion, it should be 34 parts per billion, because that's the groundwater, surface water cleanup standard, if it's going to impact a water supply, and this definitely is a water supply right here.
That's also 34 using the new 10 to the minus 5. It would be
Right.
3.4 if you use the 10 to the minus 6.
Yeah, the cleanup standard back in 95 or before used to be 3 parts per billion everywhere.
Would also add one quick aspect with the institution of consent judgment in the prohibition zone. That was put in place, and then the downgrading investigation in the wells within the city, and as you get closer to the Huron River, was done in a multi-step process after that prohibition zone was put in place. If they do follow that same process again, they would, potentially change the consent judgment, add this additional prohibition zone before they know actually which way the groundwater is flowing, so they could potentially put this added expanded prohibition zone in, later define which way the groundwater flow is, and learn afterwards that it potentially could be moving towards Barton Pond, and then have to spend additional monies to, clean up a plume that's gotten yet further along, because the prohibition zone is designed to reduce the amount of cleanup activities that are taking place. So if that goes in before there's an investigation that defines where the groundwater flow is, then it makes the problem yet more difficult to address, if in fact it does turn out that it's moving toward Barton Pond.
Yeah, at other sites, if they have something like this, the responsible party is usually required to prove ahead of time that it's not going to end up here. This is kind of a try it and let's see, which is what they've been doing all along for 20-some years. So.
And in this case, the receptor is water supply, or potential receptor.
Go ahead, Chris.
So we've been cleaning this up for 20 years or thereabouts. What was the concentration at the core to begin with?
What was the highest concentration? Well, it was pure. They used 800,000 pounds of pure dioxane over a 20-year period from 1966 to 1986. And then, so this is all this cleanup is after they quit using it in 1986, and the company finally took responsibility for the cleanup.
But certainly you didn't have pure dioxane in the groundwater at that time.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, dioxane is completely miscible in water, so
Right.
you won't get a pool of dioxane separate from the water. I think the highest well concentration they had was around 200,000.
220,000 parts per billion in the water. In the soils, it was over 2 million parts per billion.
Jeez Louise.
That's now down under 1 million the last time they sampled in the soils 8 years ago.
So progress is being made, but it's still fairly frightening.
Well, it's a persistent compound that's hard to clean up. It doesn't biodegrade by itself very well. It's something that's not going to go away by wishing it away. There's a lot of wishful thinking on their cleanup plans, and you can't wish this away. You got to actually actively clean it up, and you've got to have a professional cleanup. You can't just have a half professional cleanup.
Any other questions? Gwen, go ahead.
Why haven't they done additional tests?
Well, they've done a lot of tests. 16,000, there's over 20,000 data points, 16,000 of which have enough data that we can actually plot them. So they're doing ongoing tests, maybe not as rigorous as some places as we would like, but the testing is not the issue. It is what do you do with the data once you have it? And there's a lot of data in the past that they've ignored key places. They've ignored data that's got us to this point, and we can't have any more of that. We can't, we have power now with the PC tools and things like that to really know what's going on more than some of the decision makers. The judge has not seen this unless he's watching today. And this has been we've had this for a couple of years now. And before that we had it, Excel versions of graphs and things. The decision makers, the real decision makers now, are not privy to this because either they don't want to, or it's not being passed along to them in a forthright way. And it's time for that kind of thing to stop, and everybody to get together on the same page and do this right. Just like we started to do in 1995 when Kim Davis was in charge of the cleanup at Gelman Sciences, and we actually had monthly meetings with citizens and local governments with the Gelman people before the cleanup was taken back away from him, just before the merger and Pall Corporation took over. I don't want to go into all that detail. It's a lot of complication, but
Let's take one more question, Valerie, and then we'll...
So this is for Michael. What you were saying regarding the study, I think this is what Gwen was alluding to. Have they not done a mod flow or extensive geohydro model, like
They've
3D
done
model?
A couple of.
Mike, just be by the mic so everyone on the public can hear.
Yep. They've done a couple of hydrogeologic models over the years. One of them encompasses more of the core area, and on the map, more in, get too far away, the core area and some of the evergreen, but that model, I think, trying to think what year, 2004, was deemed another confidential item. So only the DEQ and Pall were essentially privy to that. The public didn't get a chance to review that. The other models that they've done, like the graphic that's in the background here, this was a flow model to look at the capture zone in the evergreen area. That was a public model that was able for public review, but it was not a site-wide model. It was looking at that specific location in the capture zone in that area.
Okay.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thanks.
Yep.
Matt, I'm going to leave this DVD of this and some,
I'll leave that with CTN in case they need it to replace what they took a picture of.
all right, thanks very
Thanks,
much.
Roger. Thanks, Mike.